Good evening. It's my pleasure as Treasurer of the Law Society to welcome you here tonight. Je m'appelle Malcolm Mercer, Trésorier de Barrow. C'est un plaisir de vous souhaiter le bienvenue aujourd'hui. I'd like to start by recognizing we're here together in Toronto, which comes from a Mohawk word, takaronto, which means where there are trees standing in the water. I acknowledge we are meeting on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I acknowledge the Haudenosaunee and the long history of all the First Nations in Ontario and the Métis and Inuit people. I say this in spirit of reconciliation and the importance of reminding all of us that we share this land with one another and with Indigenous people. Facilitating access to justice in Ontario is part of the Law Society's statutory obligation. Attaining our common goal of an accessible, fair, and effective justice system for Ontarians requires genuine and respectful collaboration. The Law Society is committed to collaboration with all of our justice sector partners. Numerous reports over the years acknowledge that there is a growing access to justice need. In fact, access to justice is the most central and relevant challenge facing the broader legal community today. Just a couple of weeks ago, drawing from extensive research from around the world, the Canadian Forum on Civil Justice published a new report suggesting that there are positive returns on access to justice services and program investment, such as civil legal aid, community-based justice programs, pro bono services, and alternative dispute resolution. According to its new report, Investing in Justice, the costs borne by Canadian Treasury from individuals not being able to adequately address their justice problems is $800 million more or less annually. Let me introduce tonight's keynote speaker. Trevor Farrow is a professor, former Associate Dean of Osgoode Law School. He is the chair of the Canadian Forum on Civil Justice. He was the founding academic director of the Winkler Institute for Dispute Resolution. Earlier this year, Trevor was invited to join the OECD's Advisory Justice Research Consortium, an international group of researchers designated to assist the 36 OECD member states with their efforts to develop access to justice strategies as part of their overall development projects. Professor Farrow, and I'm supposed to say Professor Farrow, except it's Trevor. Trevor's teaching and research focus on the administration of civil justice, including access to justice, legal process, legal and judicial ethics, advocacy, and globalization. I've had the pleasure of working with Trevor over the years, particularly through his contributions to the Canadian Association for Legal Ethics. It's no exaggeration to say that Trevor has played a central role in the legal ethics community particularly, but in the access to justice community more generally. Trevor has received teaching awards from Osgoode Law School, from Harvard University. He has a background as a litigation lawyer at Torrey's. Without further ado, I give you Trevor and thank him for being with us.
Thank you very much. I would normally say thank you, Malcolm, but in this building I'll thank the Treasurer so much for those kind comments and thank the Law Society for the kind invitation to be here with you in person and with those who are beaming in from outside the building. So today our plan is to speak for about 25 minutes or so about a new report in particular, but maybe more generally the idea of investing in justice in the context of the Law Society's Access to Justice Week, which I'm so delighted to be part of. In terms of this presentation, I thought what we could look at is four things. Before we get anywhere, the question of why should we care? Secondly, noticing that this is not simply a Toronto or an Ontario or a Canadian question, and I think that's important for situating this in some of the exciting work that's being done around the world. Third, I want to look at the justice funding question. There are lots of aspects to justice funding. I'm going to pick on legal aid, or not pick on, but pick up on legal aid probably primarily, which I think is of interest given the week, given the current budget in this province, given that the government is coming back into session. Seems like a timely spot to look at. And then fourth, look at some of the evidence of what we are finding and what we're seeing, and maybe where we're going to go next. So in terms of the question of why we should care, I guess one way to look at it would be to say we shouldn't bother, or it must not be that interesting, because if anyone was not totally asleep at the switch in the most recent federal election, access to justice did not feature exactly prominently in really anyone's messaging, language at the doorstep. I'm slightly overstating that, but not a lot. And that's despite best efforts and good efforts from different justice organizations, different individuals, etc. I think part of the issue is that no one really cares about it in a big ticket way outside of the legal community, or maybe some of those who have been dramatically affected by justice. So I may or may not be right about that. That's certainly my view, that whether it's a big ticket way or somewhat less than that, I don't think we've caught the imagination of those who we need to reach in order to get justice on the map, in order to move the dial. That's my view. And so, having said that, though, I don't think we need to stop there, or we don't sort of need to leave it at platitudes, sort of saying, "Oh, well, it must be important." Well, the reality is, everyone in this room knows it's important, and I'm going to spend most of my time in today's talk on what evidence we've got. It's clear from the evidence that we should be caring about justice and justice funding. And when I say we, it's not just us here, but it's all Canadians. So for a couple of minutes, I'm going to spend some time on a report that we put out slightly before the one I'm going to feature today. And this is part of a collection of studies. It was a 7-year project that we had government funding for, called The Costs of Justice. And the particular thing I want to focus on is a Canadian everyday legal needs study that confirmed some stuff that we already knew and gave us some new information around investing in justice and cost. So when we ask Canadians how they experience, whether they experience, to what capacity they experience justice, and what it costs them, we got a lot of interesting information. About 50% of adult Canadians will experience a significant justice problem over a given 3-year period. As the Canadian Bar Association would say, that's essentially all of us in our lifetime. So it's not a marginal thing we're talking about, and we're not talking about small marginal issues. These are significant issues that have impact on people's lives. It's approximately 11 million people over a given 3-year period. And for those who are counting, and this is good news, by the way, I'm in my day job, I'm a law professor, and I've got lots of students who are worried about what they're going to be doing with their law degree. This amounts to about 35 million separate everyday legal problems over a given 3-year period. So there's no lack of need out there, but that's for a different day. In terms of what kinds of problems we see, not totally surprising, when you do national studies, this lines up with other studies from around the world. There are about 50 of them in different countries. Often you see similar numbers in Canada. Consumer, debt, employment, neighbor, discrimination was actually up recently, which is unfortunate, but up in this report, and then on down. It's actually more local studies that usually you see family law as featuring as more dramatically higher than these. When you look at a bigger population, it often inverses. But again, for our national study, this is where we're at, and it lines up essentially with other kinds of countries. Again, interestingly, while we're at the Law Society in the context of the legal profession, I think it's interesting to know how people deal with their problems. And it may or may not be surprising, but of those problems, about 7% of them go to courts and tribunals. That means about 93% don't go to courts and tribunals. That's significant. And under 20% go to lawyers and legal advice to try and help with their problem. Now, this is not to say that courts and tribunals are unimportant, and this is not to say that lawyers are unimportant. That is not my thesis. And in fact, if you ask people when they did get services, legal advice, for example, features quite high. People are happy with their legal advice. That's consistent with studies that other provinces have done. And I won't give you the statistics, but when you look at research on success and how people do with their problems, it is almost, not always, but almost invariably the case that people do better when they have help. So the idea being, we got a lot of problems, everyone has them, very few people go to courts and tribunals, and only a few more go to lawyers, but when they do go to lawyers, they get typically better results. Now, I'm not going to try and make the correlation there today, but when you look at the research, you look at the outcome in terms of success, we typically know that when people get help, and often when people get help from legal advisors, they do better, they're happier, and things turn out well. We also know from the data that one of the big reasons for why people don't get help is because of cost, and that's going to be relevant as we get down into this presentation. We also know about these problems that when people don't get help, they trigger other problems, physical, mental challenges for people, and those are significant. I'll come back to the cost of that in a minute. We also know that when we look at how people deal with the problems and when they do, that they need to spend a bunch of money on them. So when you ask the average Canadian about the average problem that they had, for every legal problem that they had, they spent over $6,000 on that problem. Now, when I first saw that number, I didn't know whether that was a lot of money or not a lot of money. It seems like a lot of money, but these are relative questions, right? And so when you look at other data, that number is almost as much as people spend on average on food in a given year, and almost half as much as people spend on shelter in a given year. So $6,000 is not insignificant when you look at that number relatively to what people are spending. Aggregate numbers like 7.7 billion, it's a big number. That doesn't mean as much to me as when I think about the individual and what she's spending in her daily life and then breaking it down that way. But either way, these are significant numbers, and that's only the financial impact, right? We also know from the research that people spend a lot of time, often called searching costs, try to deal with their problem, lost holidays, lost work, etc. So the knock-on costs or the individual costs are huge. And then, of course, as the Treasurer already mentioned, when we look at the knock-on costs on the state, we now, and this is one of the novel things from this study that we didn't have before, was what is the cost collectively when we look at these problems and when people are experiencing them. And so we asked people, when you experienced a problem, did you have to access social assistance more often, and if so, how much more? And then we look at the average numbers of what that costs. Same question for employment assistance. For health, all we did is say, did you visit a healthcare provider one more time as a result of one problem? And that was the number we got, about $100 million. So that is dramatically underestimating the actual cost on healthcare that we know that this will be, because of course we know from the numbers that people experience more than one problem, and we know from the numbers that they visited healthcare more than one time. But all we felt comfortable that we could actually nail down was the floor, and so that gives us about $100 million on the healthcare system. So that's where we get to the knock-on cost to the state of about $800 million annually for the experience of these legal problems, and we think it's likely a lot more. We also know from the data that it has negative impacts on housing. What we didn't get from the data is the actual cost, but we do know, for example, that about 100,000 Canadians lose housing every year, and about 3.6% of those rely on emergency shelters as a result of experiencing a legal problem. So those are the numbers that we have. You can do the math if you can figure it out what that costs, and so that's significant as well. All areas for further research. And then we're still talking about the should we care about this. A different study that we've done at a different time when we actually asked people the questions around access to justice and what have you. One thing we asked is do you think that justice is of fundamental importance to Canadians? And we got what I thought was a somewhat surprising answer, but almost everyone, well, a significant number, 86%, said yes. So people seem to care about it, and the numbers seem to push us into a place where it seems counterintuitive, the gap between the lack of attention at coffee shops and in daily conversation and in budget meetings and in political ads and in what people are actually talking about, where we're thinking about our public space and what we know from the data about how important this should be to us. There is a big gap that we're somehow not getting. There's a different gap when it comes to medical care. If you talk about wait times, you get your politicians jumping up and down trying to figure out how to eliminate wait times. We haven't got politicians jumping up and down to figure out how to get legal aid on the radar. So that's a huge issue. Okay, so in terms of my second point, I want to just make this comment. Really, it's about situating this in a cluster of research that's going on that I think is really exciting, that may be useful to us if we care about getting this on the map. So many of you may know there are numbers. Actually, I'll just go forward for a minute. One thing that's really exciting that hasn't been on the radar before is that the UN has issued its 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and for the first time, as part of those goals, those development goals, access to justice is now featuring as a specific country goal. So these are the Kofi Annan Millennium Development Goals. Now we're into next generation where we're targeting for 2030. Member states sign up to this. There's a huge amount of negotiation that goes in behind this. Why this matters, I think, is that from the top down now, countries are going to have to respond to say, what are you doing about access to justice for 2030 in your region? And so now we've actually got to, at some point, have deputies and ministers reporting back to their counterparts at the UN on what Canada's doing for access to justice. So that's a big deal from the top down. And then going backwards, very recently, if you haven't seen it, the Task Force for Justice, which is really a consortium, it's ultimately the brains behind the operation come out of NYU, but it's a collection of international researchers. The most recent report that's come out was around May 2019, so this year. It's a really interesting, really significant report that picks up on everyday data across the world. It's not a report like the World Justice Index by country. It's more of an overview on where we are at with justice problems, where are we at with what we need, where are the gaps. There are a number of Canadian organizations that feature in this, which we're excited about. And so if you're interested in the stuff we're talking about today, I really urge on you this Justice for All report. But you know, one of the splash numbers that is now everywhere is the idea that 5.1 billion, or 2/3 of the world's population, is now living without meaningful access to justice. So it's not getting smaller, it's getting bigger. No surprise there. The wealth gap is getting bigger. Everything's getting bigger. And so here we are. The question is, do we care about it? Do we want to do something about it? And I don't think there's been a better time. We've had some interesting national initiatives. We've got fantastic provincial initiatives like TAG, like efforts that we do collaborative work here. And now I think there's a pretty big stick being swung internationally to say people need to sign up for doing something. And we'll see whether we do or not, but there's now a 10-year runway to really try and get this thing going so that when we look back in 5 and 10 years, we can say, oh my gosh, look what we didn't do back in 2020, and look what we're doing now. In the way that we look back in the 80s on diet, on participation, on diabetes, on healthcare. We've moved the dial on medical research since then. We haven't moved that dial yet, but maybe we will now. So I think that's the idea and what I think is exciting. So let's shift to justice funding, and I'm just going to put up a slide to situate my report. There are many people in the room who know this slide way better than I do and who live this slide way better than I do. But the slide is around eligibility and just making the very simple gap point that I don't think it's an overstatement to say that there's a huge gap in terms of what people need, even in terms of the low end of society, in terms of those living with most vulnerable situations, those who are marginalized. Being able to access legal aid, you need to be about $3,000, as I understand it, below the poverty line. And that's only for the services that legal aid at the moment can afford to provide, right? So it's not that we're sitting here in largesse being able to cover what we need to in terms of those everyday legal problems. So the funding gap is obvious, right? We know how many people have it. We know how many people are living at this level. And so we now know where the huge gap is in terms of people living with legal problems that can't afford to service them. Whole other conversation that we get into at some point, whether we want to dramatically increase legal aid, whether we want to dramatically support legal aid with a public-private, middle-income legal insurance. Those are all questions. However you want to come at that, what we do know from the numbers that people live every day is that we aren't meeting the demand and the gap that exists. And that, of course, was essentially prior to our current budget. And I'm not going to make this a political presentation. This presentation is about the evidence, but I will use facts, and public statements are facts. And so one of the statements that was made by the former Attorney General in the context of that budget cut, I found to be very dramatic in the context of the report we were doing at the time. Because really how I read this, and the statement is from former Attorney General Carolyn Mulrooney's office, while some lawyers may not welcome renewed accountability at legal aid, every dollar saved is a dollar we can invest in the services that matter most to people, such as public health care and education. Now, I'm not going to suggest that it's wrong to invest in public health and education. Those are good things to invest in. How I heard this was that and you can fill in the gaps, justice is not as important as health care and education. People don't care as much as that $1. Let's get it to people where people really care about it. However you want to think about it, what we ended up in the justice sector was at the losing end of this, let's take the dollar out and put it somewhere else. And so that was the sort of the straw that I think we've got to be able to answer that question, because we know that can't be right. And so we know intuitively, and we knew from various reports, that in fact investing in justice doesn't cost us. In fact, it saves us a huge amount of money. The question is, what is that? Where is that data? What are those numbers? And how do we get that in front of those who make decisions, like the former Attorney General, to try and shift the conversation to a different space? So that's the impetus behind looking at this. And that takes me to my fourth and final point, which is where I'll spend most of my time, is the remainder of my time, on a report that we've just put out. So the report is from the Canadian Forum on Civil Justice. I'm one of the co-authors with my colleague Lisa Moore. There's a nice picture of Lisa. And the report, there are copies at the front that we have here that I'm very grateful for the Law Society for including. So to cut to the chase, the idea of the report was really to try and put together I don't want to call it a story because that sounds like fiction, but a story on what do we get when we invest in justice. So it was commissioned by the Task Force on Justice, that same part of that same group that's doing that international work that I discussed earlier. When we first talked about the project, the question was, are we going to do new research, or do we know what? And then, if so, where are we going to jump in? What new research should we do? What's the intervention that's right at this time? And where we landed, partly for research methodological reasons and partly, quite frankly, for practical reasons, was no, we're not going to start with doing a new study of a new intervention. We're going to actually look around the world and see, what do we know already? And we knew there was a bunch of stuff out there. We didn't know, quite frankly, all of it at all, and we didn't know the extent of it. So what we set out to do essentially was to document the current research that's out there domestically and internationally, essentially on two topics: return on investment research and social return on investment research. And it's amazing when you start looking. It's a little bit like, you know, when you're looking for your keys, I guess, under the light, everything starts to look like keys. But it's when you start to look at the world, there's a lot of discussions out there. I mean, I don't know if people noticed the finance minister's comments around TMX. Even the minority government is now pitching the TMX pipeline as saving putting $500 million annually into sustainable energy projects that have nothing to do with oil. So it's essentially a return on investment. When we spend money on TMX, really we're going to get $500 and save it on this. So, or putting it in here. So you start to see it everywhere. What is return on investment and social return on investment? You know, most people, they often collapse those two things. It's often sort of pitched as, if you spend $1 here, how much will you save somewhere else? The way I think about it, slightly more sophisticatedly, is return on investment is really a measure of profit. If you spend $1 here, how much will you make collectively elsewhere? Social return on investment is very similar, but it's a measure of value. If you invest $1 here, what value will you create for a certain group or a certain issue or what have you somewhere else? For our purposes, the difference matters, but the difference for today is not huge, because I'm not going to get into the weeds of each of the individual studies as much as I'm going to try and paint the general picture. For those who are interested, on the Canadian Forum on Civil Justice website, we have an infographic that have bullet points for all of the different studies for this project. And for those of you who I hope are interested in learning more, I urge you to get into the different studies that we've documented in this report. So what did we find and what did we look at? Obviously, the overall conclusion was a huge positive return on investment. So almost exclusively across the world, on every study for almost every context, we saw that positive return. I'll come back to, at the end, a couple of potential critiques of that. But before we get there, let's look at what we saw. In the U.S., we primarily looked at state legal aid funded projects and research that looked at state-based legal aid projects. And that's where we found a wealth of stuff on return on investment in areas like housing, family, consumer, benefits, health, and even money that people save or that it benefited them in their lives that they then plug back into the economy. And so the studies get fairly sophisticated on their tracking that dollar into how it ends up back in the economy. And so in the U.S. state projects, the return on investment is typically somewhere between $9 and $16 for every dollar spent on legal aid. And of course, those studies were important given the gutting of legal aid in the U.S. under the Reagan era, and then the slow back and forth of a very challenging legal aid context in the U.S., some states better than others. But, you know, important data on making the case for why maintaining and potentially growing those legal aid dollars is so important in terms of it's not just the right thing to do from a moral or a human or a social perspective, it actually economically makes sense. So that's the idea. We looked at UK civil legal aid studies in terms of areas of housing, debt, benefit, employment. Same context, right? The UK's legal justice budget got gutted as well. And so they have the same issues, trying to figure out how to deal with civil legal aid. And there again, we saw significant returns across the board on return on investment studies in the legal aid context in the UK. Scotland, same thing, even larger return on investment in legal aid there. In Australia, we looked at law commissions and legal aid centers. The subtle difference really around providing services, so not just public legal information and that sort of thing, but also hubs where services are provided, and again, significant returns on investment in the studies that have looked at those. I would say Canada is probably where we need to do more work. I would not describe this country as having a significant number of studies sitting there ready to be looked at in our back pocket. That is not the case. And I'm not saying that to shame us, because I'm part of the research community as well. I say it because we need to do a bunch more. I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel, because I think there are contexts that we've already learned from elsewhere, but there's still lots more to be learned here. But in the Pro Bono Ontario study, in a Calgary Youth Justice study, in a study that we were involved in, the Canadian Forum on Civil Justice with the Centre for Law and the Family, before it closed its doors, quite frankly, because of a lack of funding. It was doing fantastic research out of the University of Calgary. That partnership, we did new research. It wasn't looking at others, and that was a social return on investment in terms of different sorts of dispute resolution mechanisms for high and low conflict family cases, etc. So Canada, we have some data on, and it's reported in the study. We looked at community-based paralegal research in South Africa, and in fact, on a different project altogether, we are partnered up with IDRC in Ottawa with 3 different African countries looking at community-based justice, which can be defined in many different ways, but for today what I'll define it as largely is it's not the traditional public state-based court system or tribunal system. It's often around those systems. It's elders, it's village systems, it's women's groups, it's paralegals, it's sometimes legal aid funded and not, but it's looking at the value of those sorts of community context-driven projects. And so a terrific project or some research in South Africa that we looked at. I think my favorite study in the whole thing is one out of Bangladesh, which was a Rural Advancement Center project, so BRAC, the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Center project. And what I thought was interesting, so that's a project that is really a robust kind of not just looking to give people some information on how they might deal with their problem, but it's much more of a thick, as I understand it, intervention in terms of services that people have. And it also, the thing that I think is really promising is that it's self-sustaining, meaning that it also, through its services, through the social services, has started to get revenue-generating projects in terms of farming, in terms of local communities or what have you, that then plugs money back into these BRACs to help move them forward. So there's some fruitful thinking there for those skeptics in the room who think that somehow our legal aid center should be self-sustaining. I'm not one of those skeptics. That's not what I'm saying. But there is some interesting research in different places that people are interested. Putting all of that together, I do think it's a powerful story. And we've known this intuitively, and we've had some numbers from time to time. You know, the Canadian Bar Association's Reaching Equal Justice report in 2013. There's been one or two U.S. studies early on, an Australian study where we had a handful of efforts to look at this return on investment study. Methodologies were questioned. What we have now are dozens of studies from different contexts looking at slightly different services, all essentially telling the same story, which is that there are huge positive returns on investment when those investments are made. So before I finish, I guess two things. One is I want to take up a couple of potential objections and then maybe mention one or two what's next. Objections. One thing I could imagine is people saying something along the lines of, I guess there are three. One I won't deal with for a minute, or very much. One is methodology. And I don't want to get in the weeds of methodology. A lot of these reports have different methodologies. They depend on what questions you ask. They depend on what services you ask, what you look at. They depend on a bunch of factors. So for us, we took the studies at face value. So we didn't get into critiquing the methodologies. We took them as they were and moved from there. You can always critique methodologies. I'm constantly critiquing my own methodologies for reports that I've just done, thinking, oh, I wished I'd asked X. But on the theory of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, I'm a big fan of trying to do your best, getting a sophisticated piece of research done, and then getting it out there and then critiquing it from then and moving on to the next one and fixing it next. Not a reckless approach. But if we're always scared of doing research, we're never going to get it done. And so I don't suggest that the methodologies across this report are perfect, but I do suggest that they all make sense, they're contextually driven, and as a collective story, what I take from them as a researcher and what I do is that it's a sophisticated menu of different approaches to the question, all of which are coming up with a very similar conclusion. Secondly, so even if it's not methodologically, people will say, well, you can always get a good story. You're always going to get a good investment if you sort of start to pitch it that way. And so, yeah, and you're always going to get high numbers, or are your numbers exactly right? And I'm willing to give that, because what my point at this stage is not to suggest that we know to the dime what we will make when we invest $1. My point is simply to say, if you invest in $1 and take that seriously, you will make multifold on that. And then how much? Well, here's a range. And I don't care whether it's the low end of the range. That's still a pretty good investment in my mind. It'll beat the market almost every day on these studies. And so the point is not to make the case for a particular number value at the high or low end. It's to paint the story that we now know that there will be a positive return, and we can give you the range that there will be. So I don't need to make the case that it's an exact number. My only point is to make the case that it's a positive number, it's significant, and here's what we know. And then I guess the third critique is to address those who would say that return on investment and social return on investment studies are best less on their own, but more as a relative. And I've got to give credit to my friend and colleague at Western, Stephen Patel, when he and I were debating this over a drink the other night at a conference. He was pushing me to think about this, which was helpful. And so what's the answer to that? Am I trying to say, you know what, we should be spending on justice more than we should be spending on police? Or am I trying to say we should be spending on justice more than we should be spending on early childhood education, or teen pregnancy, or privacy, or whatever you want? And that, my answer to that again is no, that's not my case. We may get there, and justice budgets and treasury boards will have to answer that. The case I'm trying to make is going back to the beginning. Should we care about this? Because I don't even think we're yet on Treasury's real radar. I want to get to that debate where then we can have a meaningful debate about how we should balance off between police and education and justice. I don't actually think we're being taken seriously yet. So we may have to get to that relative basis if it's a zero-sum game and say, yeah, we need more compared to policing. I'm happy to have that discussion, but that's not my project for today. It really is simply to get what I think is an overwhelming story onto people's radar and say, you've got to be kidding me. Our justice budget is a rounding error, and look at what the evidence is saying. So that's why I'm not so troubled by the relative critique of social return or return on investment studies. I'm not trying to make a comparative argument. I'm simply trying to get it on the radar. That's the idea. And I hope this report will help people who are trying to do that, and there are, I know, many of the people in the room who are trying to do that. So finally, before I stop, and we'll have some time for questions, is so what's next? So this report, as happy as I am with it, is now done. So I'm now thinking about what our next project is. through the good graces of the Law Foundation of Ontario, we have a small grant at the Forum to set up a methodology for trying to track the impact of services. And so what I think where we are, and there are very few studies like this around the world in the justice sector, is to say, okay, people are receiving a service. We think it's good. We know from the data that typically people report that they do better than if they don't. People are typically happier. Let's start to look at the impact on people's lives if they get, for example, a legal aid lawyer for 2 hours or 2 days to help them with that eviction, to help them with that case in domestic violence, to help them with that housing issue, to help them with that health issue, and to figure out 6 months and 18 months out, how has that impacted their lives, and to try and sort out from an anecdotal, or put differently, from a qualitative perspective, what are people reporting, and then quantitatively, where are the numbers on that? What's the kind of investment that that's saving us in terms of those knock-on costs? So that's where we're hoping to go next, to partner up, and we're sort of not just at the front end of this, but it's early days, partnering up with service providers, typically clinics, to work on that kind of project. Because I think if we can start to tell the story, what's the cost? Well, here's the cost individually and collectively. So what would be the return on investment? We now know that. If that's not enough, now let's start to tell the personal stories so we can grab the attention of the politicians and the op-ed pages to say, we just tracked 1,000 people. The way we do with Tylenol, the way we do with cancer drugs, we know exactly the interventions are going to be when we do that in medicine. We have no idea what the impact on, other than our intuitive ability to say, yeah, we think it helps. And we see people who are getting saved by legal clinics, but we don't have the evidence to back up what we know intuitively. So I think that's going to be the other part of rounding that circle in terms of the evidence that we need really to get this as a case that no one can refute. So that's where we're hoping to go next in terms of the kinds of studies and methodologies that we're looking at. So with that, thank you for listening. I think the idea now is we've got some time for some questions for those in the room, and I also have some questions that are beaming in from outside, which I'm happy to field as well. And we do have a mic, I think really not so much so I can hear you, but probably for those who are on the air. Why don't I start while you are, I know everyone in the room is dying to ask a question, but let me start. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to read the person's name or not, so I'll be cautious and not read the person's name, but maybe that's the wrong thing. So what are, I'm going to look at my colleagues over to, am I supposed to read their name? Okay. All right. A great question from initials ML. What are your views on possible contribution impact technology can make? So I'm going to answer this quickly because I don't pretend to be, I don't have the evidence for you, and it's not my case to make today in terms of the role of technology, although I've thought about it quite a bit in the context of legal aid and civil justice. I think, like many people, there is a huge role for technology. I think technology will, for all the efficiency reasons, for where we double up on service, for where we have services in terms of information. We've seen an explosion and of legal information, et cetera. Tons of stuff we can do with technology. My concern, and I don't think it's all that popular though, is that I worry that in a very small pie of justice funding, where we're going to pour a huge amount of money, is in court technology, and of course courts need it, I'm not saying we don't, and in do-it-yourself stuff, like the Home Depot approach to justice, which I've talked about before, but we can all tile our own bathrooms. Of course, we can now all do our own divorces and domestic violence cases. I'm not making light of that. I think it's ridiculous to think that people can do those. So I think there are tons of cases where technology is actually not going to be that helpful, or certainly not going to be the solution, and where we need actual people, lawyers, paralegals, and the like. So technology, yes, but technology is not the solution. I think it's part of the menu that we need not to be, I don't want it to be the excuse for pouring money there without actually pouring money into the services where most vulnerable people need it. anyone in the room as I go to my next question on, yes. Okay, so either way.
Hi. Thanks very much for your program. I have a question for you. It's about the new research that you're doing. So I'm a private practitioner in family law, dealing a lot with IPV clients, intimate partner violence, and marginalized people who really can't afford lawyers. And I'm just wondering, is there a role in your next research project for members of the private bar to assist with this kind of research?
So I'll give you a general answer and then a more specific. I think my answer is going to be yes and yes. I think partnering up with the private bar is going to be key. And I think it's partly important because my view is that lawyers are a central sort of feature prominently in the solution. I'm not one of those people who thinks lawyers are the problem. That's not my argument. And in fact, particularly given that I'm in this room, I actually still think there's a huge spot for self-regulation and for the Law Society. So I'm not one of those who says, let's completely divest ourselves of what we're doing. I am someone who thinks that we should look creatively and innovatively of who's involved, but I think we need to be part of the solution or society will go around the benchers, the Law Society, law schools, private lawyers, etc. So I do think we need to be part of this, and we need to be part of the research. I've had terrible luck engaging private lawyers with research, typically because of confidentiality. A number of these studies, when we try and get to clients, our contact is through their lawyers, and we rarely get there. And that's just not me. I talk to researchers across the board when you're trying to get at actual people's experiences. So I do think that there's a role for private lawyers to play in the research community and trying to figure it out, which projects, how to do that. We can talk offline, but I do think that there's a role for that for sure.
Hi, it's Marcus Pratt from Legal Aid Ontario. Thank you very much for the presentation, and particularly highlighting the gap in funding for legal aid and the importance of investing in legal aid. As I sort of hear you and look very quickly at your report, you seem to focus on civil justice issues, everyday problems, and a lot of what legal aid funding is involved in outside of the clinics is interactions with state, the criminal justice system, child protection. And I wonder if there's any research of the importance of investing in those areas as a sort of worthwhile investment of public funds.
Yeah, so I've got the unpopular answer to that question. So I don't have a good answer to your question, Mark. There is research. There's a ton of research. There's way more research, as far in my experience, on the criminal side than on the civil side, which is quite frankly why I've been interested in civil and family, is because it's been the missing piece. And I don't want to stand here and pretend like criminal justice is not important. That would be a ridiculous thing to say. But I know that legal aid, I'm simplifying, and again, you know way better than me what services you guys provide, but it's not the run-of-the-mill civil cases that you guys are funding. When you ask Canadians, and this is consistent across not just the common law world, but around the world, when you ask people what problems they have and when they have significant impacts on their life, you won't be able to read this slide because it's so small. But the one at the far end, the smallest one, the 0.4, is criminal charges. So I'm not so, this is my kind of grumpy part. I'm actually not so worried about the criminal research and the criminal dollars and the police dollars and the stuff, because if anyone has the attention of justice budgets, it's all going to the 0.4. What keeps me up at night is the 22% on consumer, debt, neighbors, discrimination, family. That's where all the people report their significant problems are, and we know there's no money there, and there's very little research there. So I'm the wrong guy to answer what is a good question. There is research there, for sure. We came across some of it. We didn't really document it, and that's not because I don't care about it, but it wasn't my project, and I'm just giving you a reason for why that wasn't my project. But I do think we shouldn't undervalue the impact of civil justice and family justice on social, communal and individual well-being. It's got a dramatic impact on people's lives, broken homes. We saw empowerment studies. staying in school, and this did engage some of the, like, for example, positive bail studies that are in here, or incarceration and keeping people out of jail, the positive impacts on young people and on adults as well was dramatic. So for sure there's data, and there's some data in here on that kind of stuff. Okay, I've got MP. What do you think of compulsory pro bono hours for all lawyers? Maybe what I should do if I were smarter would be just to ask the treasurer, who's right here. But because the question was directed at me, I will answer it. And I guess I think that pro bono features prominently in what we have now. We've got a couple of studies, the Canadian study in particular, which, if I'm remembering the numbers correctly, it was 1 in 10 in terms of return on investment for pro bono Ontario study. It makes fantastic inroads, huge amount of work, tons of lawyers are doing it, gets lawyers engaged, all sorts of good reason to do pro bono. Do I think that's the solution? Absolutely not. And do I think that lets others off the hook when we pitch, and this is not your question, DM, but the person who asked it, you didn't say only pro bono, but if I think one of the challenges, it takes up a lot of the oxygen where we now say to lawyers, okay, you do the work, and that's going to fix a huge part of the problem. You know, we know that there's a nutrition and a food problem in this country, but we don't say to all the grocery stores, okay, you have to have the free section at the back, and that's going to fix our nutrition problem. That's what we're saying to lawyers. Now, you could say, well, we gave lawyers the monopoly to give this stuff through self-regulation, and that's a good argument. I've got other stuff that I think we should take advantage of because of that monopoly, but I don't think that monopoly simply then puts it on lawyers to say, you have to fix the problem. I think it's a much bigger answer to that, but I do think pro bono, there's a huge space for pro bono, for sure. Rudy.
Thank you, Professor Farrow, for the very informative and valuable presentation. Full disclosure, Professor Farrow is my legal ethics prof at Osgoode, so I miss you. I have two questions. The first question is, with respect to the return on investment numbers that you discussed, what do you think those numbers would look like if you did a targeted focus on marginalized communities, such as racialized groups, LGBTQ members, and persons with disabilities? And I think the numbers would probably be similar in American jurisdictions and in Canadian provinces and territories. I just wanted to find out what your views on that. And then I'll get to my second question after.
Okay. I think it's a fabulous question. I don't at my fingertips have the answer to break it down to give you some examples of what I think it would be. So I don't know is the real answer. I don't think it would be totally dissimilar. I don't think it would be lower. I think the communities that we're serving through the studies that are the interventions that were studied in these surveys and this research often picks up people living in marginalized communities, living in challenging circumstances, et cetera. So I'm not sure that the studies that are in the report are focusing on dramatically different communities than you've talked about. I think the other challenge is, and I'm sort of working through these methodological challenges now with this project I briefly mentioned, working with a couple of projects in African countries, is can we do justice research in totally different social contexts and make sense of that? Can we sort of export it and still use it here in Toronto, for example? And with caution, I say the answer is yes. I think we have to do it honestly. I think we have to try and take seriously what it is that we're studying there as opposed to here. And we have to take seriously the conditions in which people are living when we're studying those communities. But with those caveats, given the consistency across the board, given the consistency of methodologies and given the consistency of results, I actually do think there is huge value in comparative study here such that a report like this, I think, makes sense. But that wasn't, as I started, I don't have a great answer to your question, and I'm going to think more about it, because I do think more targeted research on different communities is helpful. I did mention the cost of justice study, and I do have some copies of that. In that study, when we studied Canadians, we were able to break that population down into slightly different categories by region, by age, by different groups. And interestingly, people's experience of legal problems was not dramatically different, all other than those that you would expect, like, for example, discrimination, like, for example, age-based issues. Different groups had different experiences. Rudy, your second one.
Yes, question number 2, and this is entirely open-ended, and answer as you may. You talked about the next steps, and so my question is a question of both policy and politics. You know, we want to move towards a major policy reform in this area, but it would also take some humongous political strategy on our part. What do you think is the most effective route for the legal profession to advance this policy reform politically? Given our political
Again, it feels dramatically self-aggrandizing for me to stand at the Law Society and tell lawyers and the profession what they and it should do to advance the policy. So I'm not. I think it's. I am going to answer your question, but I just want to give the preface by saying I don't assume to have the answer, and I think it would be dramatically problematic for me to sort of lay out the roadmap for you here in this kind of way. Having said that, I will say, and it was the answer I gave earlier, I think lawyers need to be part of the solution. And if I can be a bit provocative, and you know, I'll point the finger at myself. I'm a law professor, so I'm part of the, many would say part of the problem, because we charge huge fees as we get our students in. I'm a proud member of the Law Society of Ontario. I'm a non-practicing member, but I'm a member of the bar. So I feel like I'm in it, in the game with others. And I do think we have to be part of the solution. I think there's a huge risk if we're not. And we are, I mean, you know, all of us can get a mortgage in about 5 minutes sitting in our pajamas on our couch on one of these. You don't have to talk to anyone to get car insurance. But to do anything legal, you know, it's a different story, right? So there's a lot of work to be done, and I think we need to get into it. I think we need leadership from our regulator and from the we're lucky with the treasurer we have, who's so engaged with these issues. But we need leadership from our benchers, and I think we need a willingness from the lawyers to recognize that we are a self-regulated profession. There are very few, if any, sectors of society where society essentially says, "You guys deal with this. You set your price. We can only go to you, and we'll be happy with the result." And we have a fantastic justice system in this country. The problem is, as we know now from the research, no one can afford it. So we've got the Ferrari sitting in the garage. And I think the question is, are we okay with that? And more importantly, is the public okay with that? And so I am concerned that we're going to lose self-regulation. I am concerned that we're going to lose the ability to be sort of proactively ahead of the game if we don't really take it up. So stuff like our annual reporting, I think we should be way more aggressive with what we ask lawyers to report. I think we should be way more transparent in what we all have, what we bill, how we bill, who our clients are. Without, you know, we can aggregate it for confidentiality and stuff so that we can start to see the picture within our ranks about what we're doing, the gaps we're doing, who's servicing who, and how. If you were starting this from ground up, you wouldn't do it where we are right now. But I think we have a huge part of the solution that we can do. So it's really getting into the game. Stuff like's happening right now by the Law Society is terrific, and I think we just need more of it to keep us going. I don't want to overstay my welcome, and that answer probably just got me out of here. So I'm looking around for the hook. But are we still? Okay. Anyone in the room?
My name is Peter Sommer. I'm not a I'm not in the legal profession, but I'm just seeing a massive problem on how you get to where we are now to where you want to get to. From a point of, I really didn't know who to vote for this election. I contacted Peter Kent, Conservative. I wanted to see what his opinion was on access to justice. Never got a call back. Just before election, I would have thought he would have called back because there's a lot of people who are concerned about this. Never got a call back. When I see some of the comments, the one that you had from Mulrooney, and she is a lawyer and not overly concerned about, hey, we should put the dollars for legals more so than, or at least on an equal footing. And one of the problems I have, I've been in a legal battle for about 8 years, and I find friends of mine, most of them are professionals, they don't want to hear about the problem. They don't want to hear about my problem. They've heard it once, that's it, and they go on with their own lives. So how do you get from point A to get people interested? And how do you get politicians? I mean, I have written to Trudeau and many others over this 8-year period. And in most cases, they don't even respond. When you look at Beverly McLaughlin spoke, I think, in 1980, 17, 18 years ago, she spoke at the Empire Club about access to justice and that. And I don't think from what I'm seeing, I don't think we've moved one step forward to get to that point where you say, we got to get these professionals, these politicians on board so that they see what's going on. And I'm just not seeing that over 13, 14, 15 years.
So maybe thank you for the question. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to give a relatively short answer to an important and big question. Maybe I'll start by saying I'm not sure I agree that we haven't, maybe it was provocative, but that we haven't really gotten too far or moved much past the former Chief Justice's Empire Club speech. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think there's been a fair move within the profession to start to understand the issue, even to name it, to get on top of it in terms of what we're talking about. And a group like this would not have convened, and a week like this would not have convened 18 years ago. This wasn't happening before. And even things as relatively radical as the Law Society Act in this province that added access to justice in terms of Section 4, that's a significant addition. I don't think we know what it means yet, and we really haven't hit our stride there, but stuff has happened within the profession. You've got the Supreme Court of Canada talking about it, Culture Shifts talking about it, law schools talking about it, we've got the treasurer behind it, stuff's happening within. So I think that's significant and was a necessary but not sufficient development in terms of really getting stuff done. So we needed that to get going. How we're going to get there, and again, I don't have the magic ticket, but I think it's a bit of a top-down, ground-up. And I think the ultimate target is the people. We've been talking about trying to get the public engaged, and I think we haven't really known what that meant. And I think our most powerful ally are the 350 million legal problems every year, or every 3 years that are out there. We've got to somehow start to understand and hear that. So how do we do that? And I think the top-down, which is less important but still important, is that international UN Sustainable Development Goals stuff, because someone's going to have to answer to someone before someone has to get up at the General Assembly to say this is what Canada's doing. So there's got to be stuff to tell, and that'll be important. So that's the top-down. I don't think it's going to come from within because that's us, and we need to be ready, but we're not driving the ship. And then I do think it's a ground up. It's from the people, it's from the stories, it's in the way that we saw, and I just use the examples with, people's, you see 1,000 million people running on the streets, participation in the 80s. We didn't used to have 1,000 million people running on the streets. You get behind why that's good for people, and all of a sudden they're doing it. Organic food. People care more where they find their mangoes and their avocados than they do about legal aid, right? I mean, everyone knows exactly how to get the most expensive avocado you can get, and you're going to go and pay for it because you think it's good for you. And we have food delivered to our doors that's dramatically expensive, and we do it every day, and we're talking about it in Starbucks all the time. Until we get talking about this stuff, I think that's no one, Trudeau's not going to answer your phone call because the people aren't talking about it. So it's that ground up discussion that I think, and to do that, we have to feed them the data, we have to feed them the anecdotes, we have to be ready to support it, and we have to start to get that. And that's where I do think lawyers and the legal profession can be dramatically helpful, and researchers and law schools, to really energize a movement that gets this as part of a significant issue that people care about, as opposed to one that they're ashamed to talk about it, or don't know they've got it, or somehow it's really a rounding error in their in the budget. So that's what I think. It is a long game. I'm running the marathon, not the sprint, but it has to happen soon because we're just seeing that poverty gap grow, the income gap grow, and it's not getting any better on that front. So I'm optimistic. I actually think there's a huge amount of stuff going on. There's a big top-down movement going on. I think the legal profession has never been more alive to this. And there is evidence of that ground-up landscape. We now have to mobilize the story and get it going, and that's what we're doing. So that's my answer to the question. And with that, I think, Mr. Treasurer, I think I'm probably done. So thank you. I should probably apologize to the folks online who we didn't get to all the questions, but thank you for your questions as well.